Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Elizabeth Chamblee Birch joins me today on Writers at Work. She is the author of The Pain Brokers, How Con Men, Call Centers, and Rogue Doctors Fuel America's Lawsuit Factory. It's Elizabeth's first book, but not the first time she's written on legal matters in such a way that can fascinate laymen. Her thoughts on mass tort lawsuits have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and on National Public Radio. She is the Fuller E. Callaway Chair of Law at the University of Georgia School of Law. For the uninitiated, such as myself, a mass tort is a civil action involving numerous plaintiffs against one or a few defendants in a state or federal court. In The Pain Brokers, Elizabeth writes of a scheme by the medical and legal industrial complex that exploits a view that women's bodies are commodities and their pain not a major concern. She does so by telling us about Geri Plummer, Barb Shepherd, and Sharon Gore, who are among the thousands of women tempted by deceitful telemarketers who flew to Florida to undergo surgical procedures, setting off a flood of millions of insurance dollars to white shoe lawyers, doctors, and unscrupulous con artists. What became of Geri, Barb, and Sharon? Elizabeth tells us that and more. Elizabeth Chamblee Birch, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Elizabeth, one of the blurbs on the jacket cover compares The Pain Brokers to a pulse-pounding legal thriller. Did you know you were writing one of those?
That was the hope. I've written in pretty boring legalese for 20 some odd years. And so that was absolutely my goal. And hopefully that is the case.
Well, it's not far from wrong. As I was reading, I realized it wasn't incorrect, really. I mean, your book isn't fiction. It's reporting writ large, but it moves along nicely. It has recognizable characters. It informs the reader about otherwise complex legal matters in a way that stirs emotion, which I think would qualify it as a pulse-pounding legal thriller. What is your background as a journalist and a writer?
Well, I wanted to become a journalist. I've always wanted to be a writer. Most of my life, I've been writing law review articles, which, maybe 5 to 6 people actually read. And, the things that I write about, mass torts, happen to hundreds of thousands of people every year. And nobody really understands how they work and nothing really changes. And so I went back to school a couple of years ago. I started in 2021 and I got an MFA in narrative nonfiction from UGA's journalism school. It was my hope to write in a way that everybody would want to read and that I could explain how these cases work and what's wrong with them and how to protect yourself.
Well, you succeed in The Pain Brokers for sure. I found your writing particularly effective in your use of setting. You take really great care to place us in the physical spaces that reflect either the characters or the situation. Can you tell me a little bit about your approach to storytelling? Do you write like a cold heart, fact-laden first draft, or do you establish tone as a guide as you go along?
I wish I could say that I had some meticulous approach, but mostly it's, I try to get things out there and then I edit it a million times and then I edit it, a million more times and hopefully it eventually comes together. But writing scene, I think, was maybe the hardest for me just because it's something that was so unfamiliar to me from my background. And so, I'm grateful that you pointed that out. And I took particular care to try to place readers at the scene so that they could be there in the place where everything happens.
Yeah, and you do it without interrupting the flow. Um, it's not heavy-handed at all. It's natural. We're there. We're feeling the wind. We're feeling the sun. We're amid the chaos in the hotel room or in the law office. Um, it's really well done. Also, yeah, I admire how you manage your outrage. I could find no furious screeds that hijack the narrative flow. Is that a result of your experience as an attorney? Do you think that these things can horrify us, but they become familiar after a while, and you can place yourself at a distance.
Well, I think so much of what we hear in the news these days is a screed and, from one side or the other. And it's hard to feel emotion from that because I think, a lot of it's just sort of shut down. There's so much in the world these days that is so revolting and so horrifying. And so, my approach is always just to try to let that emotion come and build for itself. I think part of that is my background as a scholar, trying to be a neutral in some respects. I mean, it's certainly not a neutral story, but to let people feel those emotions for themselves rather than telling them what they should feel and what they should think.
You know, perhaps maybe this is a good time to talk about the particulars of the cases you're talking about in the pain brokers. Could you just summarize the issues that drive the story?
Sure. So, mass torts, a tort is a harm. It's like a punch or a kick or a car accident. And mass torts are things that happen to people on a massive scale. So, the opioid epidemic is an example. The BP oil spill is an example. And the book is about a product, a medical device that was implanted in millions of women in America. It is not a good device. It's called pelvic mesh. It was beginning to fail inside of people. But the book is actually about three women who received phone calls out of the blue one day. And the callers on the other end of the line knew an inordinate amount of information about the people. So they knew their birthdays, they knew the date that the mesh was implanted, they knew the name of their doctor, the name of their hospital, all the kind of information that sounds very legitimate. They had it on the other end. They weren't asking for it, which would maybe raise your red flag a little bit had it been the other way around. But the callers told the women that they had a ticking time bomb in them and that they had to fly to South Florida immediately to have their mesh removed. Otherwise, they would die. And at the time, the mesh had not yet been recalled by the FDA. It wasn't a great product, but it wasn't failing within everyone. And certainly, there was no ticking time bomb and there was no time pressure that they had to fly down for surgery within 2 weeks. But the idea was to try to jack up the settlement value for these prospective lawsuits because many of the people who had the product still in place were ultimately getting dismissed from their cases. And so it is hopefully a pulse-pounding legal thriller. It is about the con men behind this call center. It's about these rogue doctors that were operating out of chiropractic clinics and next to strip malls and removing 5 meshes in a day. They would put the women up at a hotel to spend the night and then fly them back home. So it was very much an operation to jack up value for everyone but the women themselves.
Do you think in all that information they had about the women, which you, it's chilling the way that you describe it. I mean, you make it very easy to imagine picking up the phone and have somebody know all of that stuff about you. Um, do you think they had demographic information about the women that they knew the level of education, for example?
That is harder for me to know. There was this data breach in India. So, as private health insurance companies began to move their records into an electronic format, they outsourced a lot of that to India. And these Indian companies realized that they were sitting on a gold mine for lawyers. Whether that information included demographics about background and health, I don't know. The range of people in the book, I tried to pull people with different education levels,
Yes.
different geographies. So one of the women has a master's degree, another one has a 10th grade education, and the other has a high school degree. So, it really does range. It's not as if they were just targeting low income, low education people.
Right. And the pitch is so strong and so targeted that the response was not intellectual, it was emotional. Right. One of the women had a nurse as a was a daughter or daughter-in-law nurse
I think that,
uh,
yeah, it's her
who,
niece. Yeah.
who
Yeah.
explained to her this cannot be real. This is not. But it was so powerful
Mhm.
that they couldn't resist.
Well, and it was so another of them was had hung up on these people multiple times before, but she happened to answer one of these calls when she was sitting next to her granddaughter in the bed and had it on speakerphone, and her granddaughter overheard the "You have a ticking time bomb in you. You have to have this removed, or you'll die." And then her granddaughter became an unwitting advocate, saying, "Granny, you have to go. You have to have this removed. I don't want you to die." So it is this very powerful emotional response. I think a lot of the women felt like they'd been told they had cancer, and it was the equivalent to that for them.
Yeah. And the amount of money that we're talking about here, you said the number of people who profited off these women is just astronomical. The women themselves got little to nothing. It kind of blows your mind. And the number of people involved between the phone call and the surgery and the aftermath, all had to be paid, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And they were paid by the women themselves,
Unknowingly, yes.
unknowingly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I was just going to say this is a procedure that, had they gone through their insurance company, would have cost insurance between $800 and $1,000. But as part of this DocuSign that they thought they were signing for, the consent to surgery and HIPAA forms, actually skipped them to the very last signature page, so they didn't see what all was included. But some of the things that were included were liens against their future settlement proceeds. And so a surgery that would have cost between $800 and $1,000 ended up costing between $60,000 and $150,000.
yeah. I think if I recall, at one point, one of the women produced her insurance card, and the receptionist said, "Oh, you don't need that here."
That's right. And she actually thought that the phone calls came from the medical device maker. Just like you would receive maybe a postcard in the mail about a car part that had been recalled and you could bring it into the service center and have it fixed. She thought that was what was happening here, was that Boston Scientific was calling her. And so when she flew down and they refused to take her insurance card, that all made sense because she thought they were taking care of everything.
Yeah. Do you remember when you first heard about the pelvic meshes uh, that were causing issues for a large number of women? I think litigation began in 2011. Is that correct? 20.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
It very quickly became one of the biggest mass tort cases at the time. There were over 100,000 women who sued in federal court, and there were countless numbers others who sued in state court. So it was a very big deal at the time.
And your involvement was as an expert in mass tort litigation, wasn't it?
That's right. I don't serve as an expert because you can get co-opted by one side or the other. But I had actually started a study, an academic study that was looking at the plaintiffs themselves and asking them how they felt about the justice system. Did they feel like they had been adequately heard? Did they feel like they'd been adequately represented? And so it was that really drew me into the pelvic mesh lawsuits because so many of the women that I talked with had heartbreaking stories,
Yeah.
and just things started not to sound quite right.
And you were giving them a voice then.
I was certainly trying to. They felt like they had not been heard. They felt many of them felt like their attorneys were not listening to them, and that they couldn't even get their lawyers on the phone. And I had multiple people tell me over and over again, I feel like a number on a spreadsheet, not like a person.
Oh, yeah. There was a page one article in the New York Times in 2018. You said it sent shockwaves through the mass tort field. And it told of how Geri Plummer was enticed into surgery, and in such a way as you referenced earlier. Um, and essentially, and I'm going to summarize this. Let's see if I get it right. Marketing firms located women like Geri who could be persuaded to have surgery. Finance companies provided high interest loans to women. Those loans were used to pay for the surgery performed by the doctors who were lined up by the telemarketers. Is that more or less it?
That is correct. Absolutely.
So what we have here is an unrelenting cycle.
Yes.
And
And
by 2018, you were very familiar with these events.
oh yeah, I mean, the difficulty was you hear these rumblings, little bits pieces of the iceberg float up to the surface, but it's really difficult to try to connect all of those into the deeper story. And that was the challenge for me. And I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to do it, but serendipity intervened. And about a month and a half into my MFA program, I got a call from a whistleblower. At the time, I didn't connect the two dots, but it turned out that he was one of the two men who was running this massive call center in South Florida.
Would you identify that whistleblower, or have you?
I did and identify him. He was happy with his name being used. His name is Ron LaSorsa, and he was one of the ones who teamed up to try to create this call center at 1,000 Corporate Drive.
Yeah. So you were, up until that point, a source for journalists, correct?
Absolutely. You know, I always tried to provide some explanations for what was going on for journalists. These are complicated cases, and I was trying to help make them less so.
And did this stimulate your interest in wanting to write yourself?
It did. You know, I've always found it fascinating how journalists are able to dig, and you know, part of my favorite aspect of working on this book was, you know, feeling a little bit like a detective, and you know, taking some of the skills that I have as a law professor and being able to turn that into a story.
Yeah, accumulating facts is a messy business, right?
It is. It's really hard to be able to piece all of those things together. You see that there are fragmented documents, and to be able to say, okay, well, how can I figure out what, you know, what is this company name? What does this mean? And it was a lot of fun for me. You know, I have, I think, over 200,000 pages of documents that eventually
Oh, yeah.
began to come together in a larger picture.
Yeah. I read a piece you wrote for Reuters in 2021. Do you recall that piece?
I do. I do.
You know, it has a lot of the same characteristics as the book.
Well, that was the very beginning of me, you know, putting my toe in the water and trying to figure out what journalists do, and can I do a little bit of scene setting that normally gets cut out of some of the stories that are more about just the facts. And um, I was able to experiment with that a little bit.
Well, I must say that for a first time or an early time, it's quite good. I mean, did it happen like this, that somebody read that article and said, "There's a book in this"?
No, that was actually long before I started working on the book. That was the very beginning. It may have actually been before, if it was in 2020, it was before I started the MFA program. It was something that I was wanting to do and wasn't sure if it was going to happen. Um, but you know, I actually did everything backwards. I wrote the majority of the book before I found an agent and wrote a book proposal, and you know, so that's how it works for the first time. You never know quite what you're doing, and you inevitably do something wrong.
And this was before the Reuters article.
The Reuters article was first, and then I started the MFA program in
Gotcha.
2021 and started working on the book in September of 2021.
No, for a reader, I read the book, and then I was just looking for your articles online. I came upon the Reuters piece, and I thought that it was very close to the tone and the voice of the book. So
Well, I appreciate that.
no,
Yeah.
I assumed it was the other way around, but okay. So you wear two hats now. Do you like wearing two hats?
I love it. You know, I love teaching. I love being able to use stories in the classroom. And, you know, I think we connect with stories in ways that we don't with just cases or, you know, sort of dry facts. And it's nice to be able to remind my students that these are real people behind these stories. And here's a little bit about them. So, you know, I always try to bring out some of the characters, quote unquote, in the cases who are not characters, but who are real people whose lives have often been upended by something like an injury.
Yeah. So before you went to your MFA program, you knew you had a story. Yes?
I knew I wanted to tell a story. I wasn't sure what that story was. I wanted to write something about pelvic mesh that didn't talk about old vaginas because it wasn't a story that I wanted to write, and I didn't think it was a story that most people wanted to read. And the challenge for me
Right.
was how do you do this sort of the follow the money story? And that was eventually what I hit upon.
Yeah. So at some level, it was intuitive for you to tell the story the way you told the story. That, for example, you knew that you needed um, those three women to to be representative of the large mass of women.
Yes, it was all, as you well know, it's always challenging figuring out who the main characters are going to be. And so it took a lot of reporting, I think, before I could identify who those main characters were.
I see. Okay. No, this process now. Um, it's fascinating to me that you knew that you had a story, or you might have a story, and then you had to figure out how to write it.
You also have to figure out who's going to talk to you and how you can get the information that you need. So, you know that there's an iceberg there, but you have to make sure you know all the facts and you have to make sure that you're not making anything up. And so, doing that was a real challenge for me, particularly because I didn't have a journalism background. I didn't know all the things that I was supposed to do to interview people. So, a lot of that was learning on the fly.
So this is unbelievable in the literal application of the word because you just did everything right, Elizabeth, and there's no reason to think you would have. You weren't a writer, but you had this story, and as you say, 200,000 pages of notes, and somehow this book comes out as very pleasing. And I actually agree with the blurb that says it's like a legal thriller. So there you go.
I appreciate that. It certainly went through many, many edits, and I had mentors in the MFA program who were extraordinarily helpful. Structure was always a challenge for me. I think we went through, I don't know, 7 to 10 different iterations for part one, which I think was the most challenging for me as a braided narrative is, how do you introduce these characters and how do you begin to let the reader know that these characters will eventually come together? Um, so that was a big challenge for me. And what we settled on is here's a character, here's a character, here's a character, and then in part two, you begin to see how their lives begin to intersect.
Yeah. And I want to discuss the three women who are the focus of your book, but you also tell us about some really slimy, unscrupulous people. Let me quote you on one of them. Vince favored colorful, unbuttoned Versace style that showed his chest hairs and gold chains. He wore gold-rimmed, rose-colored aviator glasses, his head shaved and glossy, and his goatee meticulously trimmed. But the problem with Vince, though, isn't his appearance. Can you tell us who Vince is?
Right. So Vince is a first generation immigrant from India. He was a bit of a whiz kid growing up. He early on created a online pharmacy. Now, this is back shortly after the internet actually was getting started in the early 2000s. Um, but what he was doing was an online pill mill. So he ends up getting arrested. He serves 30 months in prison for running the online pill mill where they were selling multiple prescriptions to the same person, umpteen times a day. And he gets out. He's briefly on probation, and then he's put back in prison because he is running a puppy mill. And the puppies allegedly are showing up, full of parasites on death's door. And that violated his probation because he was also running an online pet pharmacy for the puppy mill that he was helping out with. So then he gets into selling dental leads and solar panel leads, but he takes a trip to India to bury his father. And while he's in India, he meets with some of his cousins his cousins turn him on to the mass tort world, and they talk about the amount of money that they can get for a quote unquote lead. A lead is Geri or Barb or Sharon, the women at the heart of the book. And the lead that he's getting through mass torts is much greater than he would have ever gotten for, dental or solar panels. Um, and so ultimately, even that is not enough for him because he doesn't want to sell leads to lawyers, which are, maybe $3,000 a person. Instead, he wants in on the gold mine, which is the contingency fee. So he discovers that in Washington, D.C., there's a bit of a loophole where non lawyers can form law firms with lawyers. So he finds a lawyer who is willing, and they create a Frankenstein type law firm. So he, as part of the call center, is actually helping to get some of the contingency fees through his quote unquote law firm.
You described the call center scheme as it's a sort of network of interlocking companies that he and his family run, and then you described the location of the headquarters, where about 200 operators in cubicles talk to women who had pelvic mesh implanted in their bodies. Um, and one of Vince's partners says it was like a Wall Street boiler room operation, and it was bleeping magnificent.
Yes.
The callousness here is kind of hard to comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
I, I,
It
ima
really.
I imagine in your field you come upon this, but I found it. I mean, I found myself saying out loud, "How could you do that?"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, the heart of the pain brokers is Geri Plummer, Barb Shepherd, and Sharon Gore, victims of the scheme. Geri was featured in the Times piece I mentioned earlier. Barb and Sharon got to know each other after their surgeries um, at what was described as a call center turned outpatient facility, and Sharon called it a butcher shop.
Mm-hmm.
When they saw the article in the Times, Barb contacted those reporters. When did you meet these three women?
Um, I met them at all different times. I started off talking with J.R. Baxter, who ultimately comes to represent all three women. And through him, I was able to talk with Geri first, and that was kind of a long process. Um, I talked with Geri, and then eventually I was able to connect with Barb and Sharon. And before I finished writing the book, I was able to go and see them all in their own spaces. So, I went and met with Geri in Arkansas and Sharon in South Carolina and Barb up in Claremont, New Hampshire. And I think you learn so much just by seeing people in their natural environments, much more so than you can just get through a phone call.
Yeah. I have to say that Jerry's story really stuck with me. Um, because, you know, Jerry, she didn't finish high school and she was raising her four grandkids in relative poverty. But I would say that before this event occurred to her, she had a good life. She had ambitions. Um, you know, whatever obstacles were in her way, she managed to work around them. And this just crushed everything in her.
Mhm.
Or am
It
I
did.
overstating it?
No, I think you're right. And I think that's an important piece of the story is that these surgeries left the women worse off. So the mesh didn't need to be removed in all cases, and I don't think they needed to be removed in these cases. And for Geri, she went down to South Florida to have this removed. The doctor who removed it removed five in a day. When done right, this type of mesh can take 7 to 8 hours to be removed. It's sort of like rebar and concrete. It's meant to go in and then you form scar tissue around it, and it's supposed to form this sort of protective hammock. And the doctor that took Geri's out bragged to me that she did it in 15 minutes.
Oh,
Um,
good.
and so Geri has been left permanently incontinent. She goes through however many packs of diapers per day and has to change pads on her bed. And, she's terrified to leave the house because she's afraid she's going to have an accident.
Yeah. And in your next to last chapter in the book, which you is titled The Carousel. You describe Geri's life after the surgery, and she lives in a motel, and I have to say you described that room so vividly. Her abusive ex-husband is in the next room. She wants to be with her grandchildren, but she can't keep up. Her heart is failing. As you say, she was incontinent and fearful of an accident. Um, and then, I think I have this right. Her teeth were in storage.
Mhm. Yeah.
And on Facebook, she asked for donations of as little as $1 so she can dress presentably in court. Um, the, this may come from your experience as an attorney. It may become as a developing as a journalist, but you really did maintain your equilibrium here. And I would say, as a reader, I don't sense that you ever succumbed to pity, that you were wary of that.
Mhm.
Is that the
I mean,
case?
I think that's right. I think again, it's figuring out what details to include in the story so that the reader can choose whatever emotion they feel from that. For me, this was just these are the circumstances of Geri's life. How do I report this in a way that vividly tells her circumstances and the challenges that she faces? Her court hearing was in Little Rock, Arkansas. She was in Benton. She was about an hour away. She didn't have a car. She was trying to figure out, how do I get there? What do I wear to court? My teeth are in storage. I can't present myself in a way that I want to for this hearing. And so all of these things that, many of us just sort of take for granted every day were hurdles for her, and even being able to testify about the damages that she sustained as a result of this scheme.
Do you know where Geri, Barb, and Sharon are today?
I do. I have talked with them just this week. We still are in pretty regular contact, and um, I always let them know when something big is happening with the book, and I let them know when the book is coming out, and they all got advance copies of it, and I was anxious for them to read it and to, be able, because each one of them knew what their parts of the story were, but they didn't know how the whole thing would ultimately come together.
So when you look back on this experience of writing the book, um, are you pleased?
I am, absolutely. I mean, it has been, I hate to use the word fun because the circumstances are horrendous for so many of the people who are involved. But for me, it was just so delightful to be able to get to know the people in this story, to be able to understand what different people's lives are like who aren't necessarily the people that I encounter day in and day out in my law school classes. It was absolutely wonderful for me to be able to tell these stories and make sure that these voices were heard.
My guest on this episode of Writers at Work has been Elizabeth Chamblee Birch. She is the author of The Pain Brokers: How Con Men, Call Centers, and Rogue Doctors Fuel America's Lawsuit Factory. It's a book I won't soon forget. Elizabeth, thank you for writing the book in the way you did, and thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.